Ladies and gentlemen,
Amen.
Mrs. Jackie Carter.
Good evening again, everyone.
Good
Evening.
evening.
Let's go ahead and get started
Good
so we
evening.
can cover Obadiah, Jonah, and Micah, and then have time for some questions, answers, and discussions. We'll begin, as always, with our background and history of each book. And so with Obadiah, we see that the book was written by Obadiah shortly after 587 BC, which is a date that falls or that marks the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar. The central message of the book is the doom of Edom, or God's judgment on Edom. Now, the name Obadiah means servant of Jehovah, and it appears approximately 20 times, representing 13 different people in the Bible. However, the only reference to this prophet, the one that we're studying tonight, appears in Obadiah 1, which is a very short book. In fact, it's the shortest book of the Old Testament. Now, Israel and Edom did not experience good relations. So throughout the Old Testament period, we see that these two nations were bitter rivals. And the bitterness actually began when the twin brothers, Jacob and Esau, wrestled in their mother's room for the birthright. And it continued throughout the lives of the brothers, leading them to part company, which we find in Genesis 27:32 through 33. But in Genesis 33, the brothers actually reconciled. And Jacob's descendants and Esau's descendants still did not get along, even though they kissed and made up. Actually, they hugged and made up. But their descendants were still very much rivals. Esau's descendants settled in the area known as Edom, while Jacob's descendants inhabited the land that God promised Abraham, Canaan, which later became Israel. And throughout the years, there were numerous conflicts between the Edomites and the Israelites. Now, this rivalry actually sets the background for Obadiah's prophecy. And even though Obadiah the prophet is relatively known, apart from the meaning of his name, servant or worshiper of Jehovah, the book of Obadiah is a prophecy of doom upon Edom, a nation that had descended from Esau. And one way to remember that is they both begin with the letter E. The Edomites were descendants of the brother Esau. Edom occupied the mountainous region southwest of the Dead Sea. The capital was perched high on a plateau above a rock cliff approached by a narrow gorge, and it was virtually impregnable. From mountainous strongholds like this, the Edomites launched their raids on the Jews. And as Esau's descendants, they were in fact kin to Israel. Remember, they were descendants of twin brothers. But there was never any love between the two nations. The final outrage and the occasion of this book of prophecy was their invasion of Judah while Jerusalem was being sacked by the Babylonians in 587 BC. During a period of 20 years, which occurred between 605 BC and 586 BC, the Babylonians invaded the land of Israel and made repeated attacks on the city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was finally devastated in 586 or 587 BC. Now, during these invasions and attacks, the Edomites saw their opportunity to get their revenge against Israel. Thus, the Edomites joined with the Babylonians against their cousins, and they helped to wreak havoc on the land of Israel. Obadiah's prophecy came shortly after the capture of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and in his message he warned Edom that God would seek revenge, upon them because of their treatments of their relatives Israel. In his message, Obadiah also reassured Israel of God's loving concern for them, even though they had gone into exile or captivity. So as we said, Obadiah's name means servant or worshiper of Jehovah. And there's no additional information available about this prophet. In the Old Testament, there are 10 men who bear the name Obadiah. This prophet, this Obadiah, addressed people who mourned over the ruin of their beloved city of Jerusalem. The people who were now captives in another land were in great grief over the loss of their homeland, their families, their friends, and relatives. The inhabitants of Judah were not carried away to Babylon, were few in number, but they were restricted to a small portion of territory that once was their country. They survived on a virtual trash heap that had once been their sacred city. The reader can capture the heart of the grieving people by reading the book of Lamentations. It was in this setting that Obadiah brought a message of hope to God's people. He assured them that God had not forgotten them and that God would punish their oppressors, including Edom. Obadiah's message promised the people of God that God would restore them. And we know throughout the Old Testament, we see time and time again where God does restore the people of Israel. Now let's look at the central message of the book of Obadiah. The central message is the doom of Edom, or God's judgment on Edom. And the book is, the one chapter, is divided into the destruction of Edom, which occurs in verses 1 through 16, and the restoration of Israel, which occurs in verses 17 through 21. So let's look first at the destruction of Edom. As we said before, Obadiah is the shortest book of the Old Testament, divided into the two major sections. The first 16 verses are addressed to Edom and announces the inevitable fall of the nation. Obadiah prophesied that God would bring Edom down from her position of pride and false security. And in verses 2 through 4, we find these words. Look, I have made you only a small nation. Others do not respect you, but your pride has fooled you. You live in the hollow places of the cliff. Your home is up high, and you say to yourself, no one can bring me down to the ground. You fly high like the eagle. You make your nest among the stars. But I will bring you down from there, says the Lord. And that is a lesson for, I'm sure, none of us who are on, because none of us are prideful like the Edomites were.
No,
So
none of
none of
us.
us
None of
have to
us.
be none of us have to be brought to our knees and humbled and made to feel that we just ain't all that. In other words, it's not about us. So many of us think it's all about me. You know, those three words, me, myself, and I, and that's the way the Edomites felt, that the world revolved around them, that they were invincible, that no one could reach them because they dwelled in the cliffs, and they could see anybody who was approaching, and sometimes other people we know, again, not us, we don't get haughty like that and feel that nobody can reach us, but we see that God knows better. And just as he said to the Edomites, I will bring you down, he'll do the same thing for those people we know. Of course, like I say, it's not us. We're not prideful, are we? None of us. So the second major section of the prophecy concerns the day of the Lord, and that's found in verses 17 through 21. And this day would be a day of retribution, or reaping what they have sown. Kind of like my mom used to say, if you lie down with dogs with lie down with mangy dogs, you're going to get fleas. Well, that's kind of what happened. You know, God says that you're going to reap what you sow, or what you do in the dark comes to the light. Every prideful soul will fall. And that's the message that was being spoken. And for Edom, this meant a pronouncement of doom. But for Israel, it meant a day of deliverance. God would judge Edom severely, but he would bless Israel and restore them to their land. Now, as we said, this is the shortest book in the Bible. It has only one chapter, and the prevailing theme is well stated by Paul if we look at Galatians 6 and 7, which says, do not be fooled. You cannot cheat God. A person harvests only what he plants. And some of you may hear it in other translations, but if you will remember, I use the Everyday Bible translation. So it says you can't, don't be fooled. You can't mock God. You're going to reap what you sow. And that's because God is just, and he will punish people who perpetrate injustice against other people. God takes very seriously the covenant promises that he makes. In Genesis 12:1 through 3, God promised to bless those who bless his people and curse those who curse his people. And God closely identifies himself with his people. And so to curse God's people is like cursing and rejecting God himself. So what happened to Edom is a foreshadowing of what will happen to all people who abuse the people of God. And God is determined to keep faith with his people, even when his people do not keep faith with him. God said about the day of the Lord in verse 15 that the Lord's day of judging is coming soon to all nations. The Lord's day of judging is coming soon to all nations. Now, we know he was talking about the Edomites, but let's think about what's going on around the world today. Let's look at what's happening in our own country. Have we gotten so prideful that we have to be brought to our knees? Just food for thought. The Lord's day of judging is coming soon to all nations. He says, you did evil things to other people. Those same things will happen to you. They will come back upon your own head. So it's kind of like I tell the kids when something is going on and they take their little fingers and they point, he did it, she did it. And I tell them, be careful, because there are 3 fingers pointing right back at you. So you have to be careful how you treat other people, what you say, what you do, because it's coming right back at you if you're not careful. Now, let's look at the meaning of the name Edom. Edom actually means red, and this was the name given to Jacob's brother Esau because he sold his birthright for a bowl of red soup or lentil soup. But if you remember, also when he was born, he was very hairy, and he had red hair. So these are characteristics of the people who were descendant from Esau. The Edomites, as descendants, lived in Mount Seir, which was a mountainous region south of the Dead Sea, located in what is now Jordan. And Seir itself means hairy or rugged. So again, those descriptions fit Esau. We know that he was a hairy man, and that the rivalry and hatred that existed between he and his brother Jacob, even though they reconciled, continued in their descendants throughout the history of Edom. And in Numbers 20:14 through 21, we see that the Edomites rejected the request of Israel to pass safely through their land after Israel was delivered from bondage in Egypt. And God didn't forget this rejection, and so what happened? he punished Edom. And the nation of Edom lost their existence before Christ, and by the year 70 AD, they disappeared from history. So what we know about them through the Old Testament. Now, during Obadiah's day, Selah or Petra, known as the Rose City, was the capital of the nation of Edom. And the people of Edom continued to have a bitter dislike for their cousins, the Israelites. In fact, they hated everyone from the family of Jacob. According to Obadiah 10 through 14, this was their great sin. And because of Edom's great sin against Israel, divine judgment was pronounced upon Edom. And in verse 15, again, we hear those words, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all heathen, and thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thy own head." And that's from the King James Version. So, just as God promised, it happened. So today, there is no nation of Edom. Yet, there is a nation of Israel. So, if God says, "I'm going to take you out," you're gone. And that's what happened to the Edomites. Now, the second part of this chapter, verses 17 through 21, then we see God's protective mercy for his people. In the Bible, no nation or person that fought against God's covenant people ever won. Something to think about again for today when we look at the people who are against the nation of Israel. In fact, they all paid dearly. These verses express Israel's bright hope in the Messianic kingdom. Edom fell to the Babylonians, who they had partnered with against their cousins, 5 years after they helped Babylon destroy Jerusalem. And after the destruction of Edom, the Nabateans, which is an Arabian tribe, occupied the Edomite capital of Selah or Petra. So let's kind of summarize Obadiah. The meaning is worshiper of Jehovah. The author is Obadiah. It's the 31st book of the Old Testament, the shortest book in the Old Testament, the fourth of the 12 minor prophets. There are 21 verses, 670 words. Some observations. It's the only one-chapter book in the Old Testament, the shortest book, of course. Obadiah probably lived in the southern kingdom of Judah. No kings are mentioned in this book. Obadiah may have been the earliest of the writing prophets. Concerning Edom, they were descendants of Esau. Edom does mean red. They lived in the mountainous area of Seir, south of the Dead Sea. They were bitter enemies of the Jews or the Israelites. Edom refused Moses' request to allow the Israelites to pass through their land on their way to kingdom. They opposed Saul, but they were subdued by David. They